It was an ordinary morning in a quiet corner of the city. The small bookstore sat between a bakery and a tailor's shop, its front window filled with sun-faded book covers and handwritten signs offering discounts. The shop didn't look special to most people walking by, but for the woman who ran it, it was her whole world. She had owned the store for nearly 15 years, ever since her father passed it down to her. He had built it with his own hands, long before modern stores and digital screens started taking over. She loved the silence of her shop. Every morning she would unlock the door, sweep the wooden floor, and breathe in the smell of old paper and dust. It was comforting, like stepping into a memory. Some people came only to browse, some to talk, and a few just to escape the noise outside. For her, it was a place where stories lived, not only in books but also in the faces and words of the people who visited. That day started like any other. She arrived early, carrying a small cup of coffee and a brown paper bag with a sandwich she never ate until late afternoon. The sun poured through the glass window, lighting up the rows of shelves that leaned a little from age. The clock on the wall ticked softly, and the city outside was still waking up. A few minutes later, the bell above the door jingled, and an older man stepped in with 2 cardboard boxes. "These are the books I told you about," he said, setting them gently on the counter. He explained they were from his late sister's house. She had loved reading and wanted her books to go somewhere they'd be appreciated. The woman smiled warmly. "Thank you. I'll make sure they find good homes." After the man left, she began sorting through the boxes. Most of the books were old hardcovers, the kind that felt sturdy in your hands and smelled faintly of another decade. Some had notes scribbled in the margins, others had pressed flowers or train tickets tucked inside. She always found those little surprises charming. They made her wonder about the people who once held these pages, what they felt, what they were thinking when they left these tiny traces behind. She spent hours sorting, wiping dust from covers, stacking books in neat piles. Around midday, as she reached for a book with a torn spine, something slid out and fell onto the counter. It was an envelope, yellowed with age, its edges worn and soft. The handwriting on it was elegant, written in deep blue ink that had faded slightly with time. For a moment, she just stared at it. She had found notes and photos before, but never a letter sealed so carefully, tucked so purposefully. Her curiosity stirred. She turned it over in her hands, reading the words written on the front. "To my dearest." There was no name. Just those 3 words. She hesitated. It wasn't hers to read, but it had been hidden for so long, decades perhaps, and whoever it belonged to might never even know it existed. The thought made her uneasy. She ran her thumb across the seal. It was already half open, the glue long dry. Her heart beat a little faster as she carefully pulled the letter out. The paper crackled faintly, delicate and yellow like autumn leaves. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes moving over the slanted handwriting. The words began softly, almost shyly. "My heart has carried these words for too long. I don't know if you will ever read them, but I need to write them anyway." The woman's eyes lingered on the page. It was a love letter, simple, honest, and full of emotion. The writer spoke about regret, about how a misunderstanding had torn them apart. He wrote that he had tried to call, had even gone to her old house, but she had already moved away. He wished her happiness, though he admitted he couldn't stop thinking about her. As she read, the woman felt an unexpected sadness, as if the words were reaching across time, still alive with longing. There was something raw and genuine in them. The letter ended with a sentence that stayed with her long after she finished reading. "If somehow this finds you, know that you were loved more deeply than you ever knew." She sat quietly for a long while, the letter resting on her lap. The city noises outside faded into the distance. She felt as if she had just stumbled into someone's private world, a world that once held great love and maybe great pain. Who were they? She wondered. The man who wrote it and the woman who never received it? She looked back at the envelope, at the faded ink and the way the corners curled. The date written on the top right corner was 1974. More than 50 years ago. A lifetime had passed since those words were written. She imagined 2 young people, perhaps in their 20s, caught in some misunderstanding that time had never healed. She placed the letter gently on the counter, unsure of what to do next. For the rest of the day, she found it hard to concentrate. Every time she rang up a customer or arranged books on a shelf, her thoughts drifted back to that letter. Something about it tugged at her heart, a quiet voice whispering that maybe she wasn't meant to ignore it. As evening fell, she closed the shop and sat by the window with the letter in front of her. The street outside glowed with warm lights from nearby cafes. She traced the handwriting again, as if touching it could somehow connect her to the people behind it. She thought about how strange life could be, how a letter written decades ago could find its way into her bookstore today. Maybe it was chance, or maybe it was something more. She didn't believe much in fate, but lately, she had started noticing small coincidences. Books falling open to certain pages, strangers sharing familiar stories, the way certain moments felt heavier than others, as if carrying meaning she couldn't see. The letter felt like one of those moments. That night, she placed it carefully inside a small box she kept under the counter, where she stored small keepsakes customers had accidentally left behind, rings, bookmarks, receipts. But this one felt different. She knew she wouldn't be able to stop thinking about it. The next morning, she arrived early again. The city was quieter than usual, wrapped in the cool stillness of dawn. She made herself tea, then took out the letter once more. The sunlight caught the paper, highlighting the graceful curves of the handwriting. It felt almost alive. She decided to check the name written at the bottom of the letter. It was signed simply with a first name, Daniel, that was all. No last name, no address except for a faintly visible stamp mark on the back of the envelope, which had partially faded over time. She squinted at it, trying to read the letters, but they were too blurred. Still, something inside her said she had to know the rest of the story. She spent the rest of the morning sorting books with one hand and thinking with the other. Who had donated these boxes? The man said they belonged to his sister. Maybe she had once known the people from the letter. Maybe she was the woman it was written for, or someone close to her. It sounded foolish even to her own thoughts, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the letter had ended up with her for a reason. She wasn't sure what that reason was yet, but she felt it deep in her heart. Later that day, one of her regular customers, an elderly man who loved reading history books, stopped by. He noticed the letter on her counter. "Old one, isn't it?" he said with a smile. "Yes," she replied softly. "I found it inside a donated book." He leaned closer. "Funny how things travel. You never know whose hands they'll end up in." His words made her pause. Maybe that was it. Maybe she was meant to be the one to bring it where it belonged. As she watched the man leave, she looked down at the letter again. The handwriting seemed almost to watch her back, patient and timeless. She didn't know yet what she would do, but she knew she couldn't just tuck it away and forget about it. The bookstore, which had always been a place of quiet routines, suddenly felt filled with mystery. Every book seemed to whisper secrets, every shelf felt alive with possibility. That night, as she locked up and turned off the lights, she looked back through the glass door at the rows of books glowing faintly under the street lamp. The letter rested safely in the small box under the counter, but she felt its presence like a heartbeat in the dark room. She didn't know it yet, but that single forgotten letter was about to lead her down a path that would touch not only her life, but also the lives of people who had been waiting, without even realizing it, for 50 long years. The next morning began with a gray sky and a soft drizzle that tapped against the shop's window. The woman stood by the door, watching raindrops slide down the glass, lost in thought. The letter still rested inside the small box beneath the counter, but it might as well have been sitting inside her mind. Every time she tried to focus on something else, the words came back to her. She couldn't shake the image of the man who had written it. His voice in her head was gentle but sad, full of hope that had never reached its destination. It bothered her, thinking about how life could be changed so completely by a single lost letter. Around noon, a few regular customers stopped by, and she smiled politely, ringing up their books. But her thoughts were far away. After the last customer left, she made herself tea and sat down behind the counter. She took the envelope out once more, turning it over and over, studying every mark. There was a faint stamp in the corner, barely readable, but she could make out part of a street name. That tiny clue made her heartbeat quicken. She pulled out her old notebook and wrote the words she could see. Hawthorne Saint. That was something. She had heard of a street by that name in a nearby neighborhood, an older part of town full of houses built in the 50s. She hesitated. Was she really about to go looking for people she didn't know? Based on a letter written half a century ago, it sounded ridiculous, yet the thought of leaving it unsolved felt worse. That evening, when she locked the shop, she didn't go home right away. Instead, she drove to the old neighborhood. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled damp and clean. She parked on a quiet street lined with tall trees whose leaves whispered softly in the wind. Most of the houses looked lived in, with warm light glowing through their curtains. She walked slowly, glancing at the numbers painted on the mailboxes. Some were new, others rusty. She didn't have an exact address, but she hoped anything would feel familiar. She felt foolish wandering there, but curiosity kept her moving. After a while, she stopped in front of a small white house with a front porch and an overgrown rose bush. Something about it felt right. She couldn't explain why, but it pulled at her. She stood there for a moment, thinking about how strange it was that she might be standing outside a place once connected to the person who wrote that letter. A car passed, and she realized how odd she must look, standing in the dark with a piece of paper in her hand. She sighed and decided to go back. Maybe she needed to think this through more carefully. The next day, she did something she hadn't done in years. She went to the local library. She asked the librarian if they had any city directories or old address records. The librarian, an older woman with kind eyes, led her to a dusty shelf in the back. "What are you looking for?" she asked politely. "I'm not sure," the bookstore owner admitted with a small laugh. "Maybe a name, or a story that got lost." The librarian smiled knowingly. "Aren't those the best kind?" She spent hours flipping through old directories, tracing her finger over faded names and addresses. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but after almost giving up, she saw it. Her heart skipped. In the 1974 listing, there it was. Hawthorne St., house number 42, D. Whitmore. D. The same initial as the letter's signature. Daniel. She quickly wrote it down in her notebook. It was a small victory, but it felt like uncovering a hidden piece of a forgotten puzzle. That night, she sat at her kitchen table staring at the name. She tried searching old newspaper archives online, but there wasn't much to find. Still, she managed to locate a small notice from the late 70s about a man named Daniel Whitmore, who had worked at a post office in the same neighborhood. There was no photo, no details about his life, but it was enough to make the story real. She leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. This wasn't just a letter anymore. It was part of someone's history, a real person's voice echoing through time. The following morning, she decided to take another step. She printed the notice she'd found and pinned it to a small board behind her counter next to the letter. A few regular customers noticed it and asked about it. When she told them the story, their faces softened with interest. One of them, a retired teacher, said, "Sometimes fate waits until we're ready to listen." The words stuck with her. Maybe she really was meant to find this. A week passed. Life in the bookstore went on as usual, but beneath the daily routine, she kept searching. She asked the man who had donated the boxes if his sister's name was Whitmore, but he shook his head. "No," he said kindly, "but she used to live on Hawthorne Street years ago. Maybe that's how the book ended up with her." The connection made sense. The book must have been passed along or bought secondhand before it came to her. But there was still one question that kept her awake at night. What had happened to Daniel and to the woman he wrote to? One afternoon, a young woman came into the shop looking for old romance novels. As they chatted, the conversation drifted to the letter again. The young woman listened closely and then said, "My grandmother's name was Ellen. She used to live on Hawthorne Street too. I remember hearing stories about a man named Daniel who used to write to her." The bookstore owner froze. "Do you remember anything else?" The girl shook her head, thinking, "Not much. Just that she said they lost touch after something went wrong. I think she kept one of his books, though." The words hit her like a rush of wind. "Could it be?" She asked carefully, "Is your grandmother still living?" "Yes," the girl said. "She moved to the countryside a few years ago. I visit her sometimes." For a moment, the bookstore owner didn't know what to say. She felt her heart beating fast, like she was standing on the edge of something important. "Would it be all right if I showed her something?" she finally asked. The girl nodded, a little puzzled but curious. "Sure, I can ask her." They exchanged contact numbers, and the woman promised to be in touch. After the girl left, she sat in silence for a long time, her hands trembling slightly. It felt unbelievable. After weeks of wondering, she might have just found the person the letter was meant for. That night, she didn't sleep much. She kept replaying the possibility in her mind. What if the grandmother was the same woman? What if she had lived all these years not knowing about the letter that could have changed everything? 2 days later, the young woman called. "My grandmother said she'd like to see the letter," she said. She doesn't remember everything these days, but she was curious. The bookstore owner agreed instantly. When the day came, she drove to the countryside, carrying the letter carefully inside a folder. The road stretched through quiet fields and small clusters of trees. She tried to calm herself, but her hands felt cold on the steering wheel. She wasn't sure what to expect: tears, surprise, silence. But she knew she had to go through with it. The house stood on a small hill, white and peaceful, surrounded by flowers. The young woman greeted her at the door and led her inside. In the living room, an elderly lady sat by the window, her gray hair tied neatly, her eyes kind but distant. She looked fragile yet graceful, like someone who had once lived a full life. "This is her," the granddaughter said softly. "Grandma, this is the lady who found something for you." The old woman smiled faintly. "Something for me?" The bookstore owner stepped closer, her voice gentle. "I found this inside a book that was donated to my shop," she said, handing her the letter. "I thought you might want to see it." The old woman took it with trembling hands. The moment she saw the handwriting, her eyes widened. Her lips parted, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then very softly she whispered, This can't be." Tears welled in her eyes as she traced the ink with her fingers. "I thought it was lost forever," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought he forgot me." The bookstore owner felt her own throat tighten. The air in the room seemed to grow still, heavy with the weight of old memories finding their way back. The old woman looked up at her, eyes shining with both sadness and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know what this means." At that moment, the bookstore owner realized she had done the right thing. She had given back a piece of someone's past, a love that had waited 50 years to be heard. And though she didn't know it yet, this meeting was only the beginning of a chain of moments that would bring closure not just to one woman, but to an entire family who never knew how much one lost letter could change everything. The drive back from the countryside felt long and quiet. The woman kept replaying the meeting in her mind, the look in the elderly lady's eyes when she held that letter, the way her voice trembled as she said his name. It was one of those moments that made the world feel small, as if time had folded in on itself just so two stories could finally meet. That night, back in her apartment, she placed the now empty folder on her table and sat down in silence. She didn't feel tired, only thoughtful. She had done something that felt right, but her heart wasn't fully at rest. There were still questions swirling in her mind. Who exactly was Daniel Whitmore? What had happened to him after he wrote that letter? Did he ever find peace? The next morning at the bookstore, she noticed something strange. The granddaughter had sent her a message late at night. It read, "My grandmother hasn't stopped talking about the letter. She says it feels like a missing piece of her life has come back. But she also keeps asking, what happened to him?" The words hit her deeply. The same question that had been haunting her was now haunting someone else. She sat behind her counter, staring at the message, and felt the weight of unfinished stories pressing on her. That day, the bookstore was quiet. Only a few customers came and went, their footsteps echoing softly between the shelves. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes and the sky hung low and gray. She pulled out her notebook and flipped to the page where she had written Daniel's name. Maybe it was time to look for him, not just for curiosity's sake, but for closure, for everyone's sake. She began with what she had, a name, a decade, and a possible workplace. She remembered the old newspaper mention that said Daniel Whitmore had once worked at a post office. That seemed like a good place to start. After lunch, she decided to visit the city records office. It was an old brick building with tall ceilings and a faint smell of dust and ink. Behind the counter, a clerk greeted her politely and asked what she was looking for. "I'm trying to find some information about someone named Daniel Whitmore," she said. "He might have worked for the Postal Service in the 1970s. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "That's a long time ago," he said. "But we do keep employee records. It might take some digging." She nodded and waited while he disappeared into a back room. Minutes turned into half an hour. Finally, he returned with a folder and a sympathetic smile. "I can't share personal details," he said, "but I can confirm he worked here until 1976. After that, it looks like he moved out of town. No forwarding address listed. Do you know where he went?" she asked quietly. The man shook his head. I'm sorry. That's all it says. She thanked him and left, feeling both frustrated and hopeful. Every small piece of information seemed to pull her closer to something, even if she couldn't see where it led yet. Over the next few days, she couldn't focus on her usual work. The bookstore ran almost on autopilot as she searched old archives, talked to local historians, and even called the post office headquarters to ask about long-retired employees. Most of her efforts ended in polite dead ends. Still, she didn't stop. One evening, while scrolling through old newspaper clippings online, she stumbled upon a small obituary dated 1982. It mentioned a man named Daniel Whitmore who had passed away in another town, a few hours away. It was brief, only a few lines, but it mentioned he had no surviving family. Her chest tightened as she read it. She didn't know him, but she felt the loss all the same. It was strange how someone from the past could begin to feel familiar just through words on paper. The next morning, she drove to that town. The journey took her along quiet highways and through rolling hills, her mind filled with mixed emotions. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. Maybe a record, a grave, or just a sense of peace. The cemetery was small, surrounded by tall oak trees. She walked among the rows of gravestones, reading names until she found his. Daniel Whitmore, 1947 to 1982. The stone was simple, clean, and surprisingly well kept. She stood there for a long time, the wind brushing against her coat. You never knew, she whispered softly. She never got the letter. For a moment, she imagined the young man he must have been, sitting at a desk late at night, pouring his heart onto paper, hoping that his words would reach the woman he loved. And then she imagined him never knowing that the letter was lost, that it would one day resurface in the hands of a stranger who cared enough to find the truth. It felt unfair, but also beautiful in its own way, like life had taken the long road just to bring the story full circle. She picked a wildflower from the grass nearby and placed it gently at the base of the stone. Then she whispered, "She remembers you." The wind seemed to grow softer then, and she closed her eyes, feeling a quiet calm spread through her chest. When she returned home, she called the granddaughter and told her what she had found. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then the young woman said softly, "Would you tell her? I think she'd want to know." A few days later, she drove back to the countryside. The old woman was sitting in her armchair again, sunlight spilling over her shoulders. She looked up with a gentle smile as the bookstore owner entered. "I was wondering if you'd come back," she said. The woman sat beside her and took her hand carefully. "I found him," she said quietly. "He passed away many years ago, but he never stopped waiting. He stayed in town for a while, and when he left, there were no records of him marrying or moving on." The old woman's eyes filled with tears, but her expression was peaceful. "I knew," she whispered. "Somehow I always felt he didn't stop loving me. We lost touch because of something silly, something that could have been fixed if we had just talked one more time." She looked down at the letter in her lap. "I waited for him to write again. I thought he had changed his mind." "But he hadn't, had he?" The bookstore owner shook her head. "No, he hadn't." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt full of memories, of what-ifs, of unspoken forgiveness. Finally, the old woman smiled faintly. "You know," she said, "maybe it's better this way. Maybe some love stories are meant to stay unfinished, so they can stay pure." Her words stayed in the bookstore owner's heart long after she left that day. Back in her shop, she stood by the counter where it all began, the same counter where the letter had fallen out of an old book weeks ago. The store looked the same, but she didn't feel the same anymore. She realized that what started as curiosity had turned into something much deeper. She had connected two souls separated by time and fate. She had carried their voices across decades and given them both a kind of peace, but she also felt something stir inside her, a quiet longing, a reminder of how fragile human connections can be, and how easily we lose them when we don't speak our hearts. In the evenings, she found herself rereading the copy of the letter she had kept. She had made it before returning the original, not to invade their story, but because it had become a part of her own. Every line reminded her of what mattered most: the courage to love, the risk of silence, and the strange way life can bring strangers together to finish what others started. Sometimes, customers would see her sitting by the window, staring thoughtfully at nothing in particular, and they would wonder what she was thinking. but she never told them. Some stories, she realized, didn't need to be told aloud. They just needed to be remembered. What she didn't know was that her part in this story wasn't over yet. The letter had already changed 2 lives, but soon it would begin to touch more. Because once a truth finds its way into the light, it keeps moving, finding others who need to hear it. A few weeks passed since she returned the letter. The bookstore was quiet again, but something inside her had changed. The shelves looked the same. The sunlight fell in the same soft patterns across the counter, yet the space felt filled with new meaning. It was as if the story of that lost letter had soaked into the walls, leaving behind something invisible but alive. One afternoon, while she was arranging a stack of poetry books, her phone buzzed. It was a message from the granddaughter. "She's been better lately," it read. "She keeps the letter by her bedside. She says it feels like he's finally home." The woman smiled softly as she read those words. There was a quiet relief in knowing that something as small as an old piece of paper could bring such peace after so many years. She typed back a short reply. "I'm glad she found comfort." That letter found its way just like it was meant to. Days rolled by. Life settled back into its gentle rhythm. People came in looking for books, sharing bits of their stories, leaving behind traces of themselves the way readers always do. But the woman couldn't stop thinking about the idea of fate, how things seem to happen exactly when they're supposed to, even if they take decades to unfold. One chilly morning, she opened the shop early. The air smelled of rain and the streets were quiet. As she unlocked the door, she noticed an elderly man standing outside, leaning on a cane. His eyes were kind but tired, and he smiled faintly when she greeted him. "Good morning," she said warmly. "Looking for something special?" He nodded. "I read in the paper about a letter found in your shop. My niece told me about it. I used to know a man named Daniel Whitmore." The woman froze for a moment, surprised. "You did?" "Yes," he said with a small laugh. "We worked together at the post office back in the 70s. He was a quiet fellow, always writing things down in a notebook. I never knew what about until I heard your story. I thought maybe I could come by and tell you something." She guided him inside and offered him a seat near the window. The morning light touched his weathered face as he looked around the shop. "He talked about someone once," the man began. "Said he made a mistake he couldn't undo, that he wrote her a letter but wasn't sure if she'd ever see it. He kept that notebook with him every day after. When he left town, he said he was going somewhere quiet. I always wondered what became of him." The woman listened, her heart full. She had imagined Daniel's voice so many times that hearing someone speak about him felt surreal, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. "I found his grave," she said softly. "And the woman he wrote to." She finally read his words. The old man closed his eyes briefly as if saying a silent prayer. "Then I suppose he got his message across after all," he whispered. They talked for almost an hour. He told her how Daniel used to stay late at work, helping others finish their tasks. How he carried a small photograph in his wallet, a picture of a woman standing by a lake. How he always believed some things once written had a life of their own. When the man finally stood to leave, he smiled at her. "Thank you for finding his story," he said. "Not everyone gets to make something right after so long." After he left, the woman sat in silence, feeling both the weight and wonder of what she had just heard. It was as if Daniel himself had spoken through his friend, reminding her that love, real love, doesn't vanish. It simply waits. Later that evening, the granddaughter visited the bookstore again. She looked brighter than before, her eyes soft with warmth. She handed the woman a small envelope. "Grandma wanted you to have this," she said. "She wrote it yesterday." The woman thanked her, and when she was alone again, she carefully opened it. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "Dear friend, you gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." After reading Daniel's letter, I realized that love never leaves. It only changes shape. He was gone, but his words stayed alive, waiting for someone kind enough to listen. You were that someone. Thank you for bringing him back to me. Thank you for believing in something most people would have ignored. I hope you keep doing that for others too. The world needs more hearts like yours. At the bottom was a shaky but clear signature. The woman pressed her hand to her chest, feeling tears sting her eyes. It was the kind of letter that didn't just say thank you. It blessed you in ways words couldn't fully explain. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, the city quiet outside, thinking about how stories travel, sometimes through books, sometimes through memories, sometimes through people who were never meant to find them but did anyway. She thought about Daniel, about the woman who had waited for him, and about all the moments that had led her, an ordinary bookseller, to be the bridge between two souls. A few days later, she visited the countryside one last time. The granddaughter met her at the door, her face calm but serious. "She passed away peacefully last night," she said softly. She was holding his letter when she went. The words hit like a wave, sad and beautiful all at once. The woman felt tears fall before she could stop them. The granddaughter hugged her gently. "She said she felt at peace," she whispered. "She kept saying she was finally home." They sat together for a while, the afternoon sunlight spilling into the room, everything quiet except the sound of wind brushing through the curtains. When she drove home later, the road looked different somehow. Every tree, every shadow seemed to hold a story. She realized that what she had done wasn't small. She hadn't just found a letter. She had helped complete something that life itself had left unfinished. Back in her bookstore, she decided to do something she hadn't planned before. She took the copy of the letter she had made and placed it inside a small wooden frame. Beneath it, she wrote a note, found between the pages of an old book, proof that love can travel through time. She placed it on a shelf near the counter where people could see it. Customers often stopped to read it, some smiling softly, others quietly wiping their eyes. And every time she saw someone pause in front of it, she felt that same warmth rise in her chest. Weeks later, one of her regular visitors, a young man who came often but rarely spoke, asked her, "Do you think stories like that still happen?" She smiled gently. "I think they happen every day," she said. "We just don't always notice them." From that day on, she started a new tradition in her shop. She placed a small box near the counter with a sign that read, "Letters that never found their way." People could leave letters there, unsent messages, words they never had the courage to say. Within months, the box began to fill. Some letters were written to lost friends, others to parents, lovers, or even their younger selves. She never opened them. She simply kept them safe. And somehow people began saying that her bookstore felt different, that it had a kind of peace, a softness that made them want to stay longer. The woman never told anyone about the letter that started it all, not in full. But sometimes when she was alone at closing time, she would glance at the framed copy by the counter and she would whisper, "You found your way home." Because she knew that some stories aren't meant to stay hidden forever. Some stories wait patiently for the right hands, the right heart, the right moment, and she had simply been lucky enough to be there when fate decided to turn one final page. Months passed after the old woman's peaceful goodbye. The bookstore had gone back to its quiet rhythm, but something inside the owner had changed forever. Each morning when she unlocked the door and the familiar scent of paper filled the air, she felt a quiet sense of gratitude. The shop no longer felt like just a place where books were sold. It felt like a living heart that carried stories, both written and unwritten. The small framed letter near the counter became something of a silent guardian. People often stopped to read it. Some smiled, some sighed, and others simply stood there for a long moment lost in thought. Many never asked about it, yet it left a mark on them. The woman could tell from their eyes that it reminded them of something or someone they once loved. She started noticing how often people came not just for books, but for company. One woman visited every Friday and spent hours sitting by the window, reading quietly but never buying anything. A young man came each week, dropping a folded paper into the box marked, "Letters that never found their way." Sometimes he left 2 or 3 at a time. And there was an older gentleman who liked to talk about his late wife as if she were still alive, sharing stories that made both of them laugh. The woman realized something beautiful. People weren't just leaving letters. They were leaving pieces of their hearts behind, trusting her shop as a place that would hold them safely. One evening, as she was closing up, she found a letter sitting on the counter. There was no name, just a note on the envelope that said, "Please read this one." Normally, she didn't open the letters people left, but something about this one felt different. She carefully unfolded the paper. It began with simple words. "Dear whoever reads this, I come here often and see how people leave their words behind. I've been afraid to speak mine, but today I felt I should. A year ago, I lost my mother. She used to tell me stories every night, and she always said, 'Books remember what we forget.' When I read the framed letter here, I understood what she meant. I realized that love doesn't fade. It only waits for someone to see it again. So I just wanted to say thank you for giving us a place to remember. Tears filled her eyes. She folded the letter gently and placed it beside the framed copy of Daniel's note. The bookstore felt quiet, almost sacred. It was no longer just her space. It had become a place of connection, healing, and unseen threads that tied strangers together. Winter arrived softly that year. On cold mornings, she made tea for the regulars who came early. People would gather by the small heater near the corner, sharing stories, sometimes even reading letters aloud. It became something of a ritual. One snowy afternoon, the granddaughter returned again. She looked peaceful this time, her face calm but bright. She held a small wrapped package. "My grandmother left this for you," she said with a smile. "I found it while sorting her things. She wrote your name on it." The woman took it carefully, her hands trembling slightly. Inside the wrapping was a small faded book of poems. There was a note on the first page in the same gentle handwriting. "For the kind soul who returned my heart to me." Underneath, there was another line, one that felt almost like it was written for everyone who would ever read this story. "Sometimes love is delayed, not lost." The woman closed the book, holding it against her chest. That night, she placed it on the same shelf where the letter was displayed. It felt like everything had come full circle. What had started as a forgotten letter had now become a message passed forward, quietly teaching others that love, kindness, and memory can travel further than we ever imagine. Over time, the bookstore gained a kind of quiet reputation. People from nearby towns began visiting after hearing whispers about the shop where letters find peace. Some came just to look at the framed letter, others to leave one of their own. And though the woman never tried to turn it into anything grand, it became something bigger than her, an unseen network of hearts connecting through shared words and untold stories. One morning, a journalist came by. She'd heard about the story and wanted to write an article. The woman hesitated at first. She never liked attention, but eventually agreed. She told the story simply, without adding anything extra. She spoke of how she found the letter, how it reached the family it belonged to, and how that one moment changed everything. A few weeks later, the article was published. It spread quietly but widely, touching people far beyond her small town. Letters began arriving from across the country, people sharing their own stories of lost words, old loves, and memories that never faded. Some sent letters for the box asking if they could be placed there too. She kept every one of them. Her shop walls slowly filled with kindness. And though the world outside kept moving fast, her little bookstore stayed the same, a still point in a noisy world, where stories continued to find their way home. Years later, as she grew older, she sometimes thought about that day she found the letter tucked between two forgotten books. She smiled at how something so small had reshaped so many lives, including her own. It had taught her that fate doesn't always arrive loudly. It can come softly, through an old folded page, through the quiet hands of a stranger, through the simple act of caring enough to wonder. One spring afternoon, she sat near the window with a notebook of her own. For the first time in a long while, she began to write. Not for anyone else, but for herself. She wrote about the old letter, about the woman who waited, the man who wrote, and the granddaughter who carried their love forward. She wrote about how kindness multiplies, how a single act of care can ripple through time, and she ended it with one line that captured everything she had learned. Every story left behind is waiting for the right heart to find it. When she finished writing, she placed the notebook in a small wooden drawer behind the counter, smiling to herself. She didn't label it or tell anyone about it. She simply left it there quietly, the way fate had once left the old letter for her. Years later, when a young girl bought the bookstore after she passed away, she found that same notebook tucked away in the drawer. Curious, she opened it, and as she began to read, she smiled, realizing what a treasure she had found. And so, just as before, the story began again. Because stories like that never really end. They live on in the people who find them, in the hands that pass them forward, and in the quiet spaces where hearts still believe that love always finds its way home. Years had passed since the story of the old letter first began. The bookstore, once a quiet corner of the town, had become something much more, a place of connection, kindness and memory. The woman who once ran it had long since passed, but her presence seemed to linger between the shelves, in the way sunlight fell across the wooden floor and in the quiet hush that always filled the air. The new owner, a young woman who loved stories as much as breathing, often felt as though she were being gently guided. She had found the old notebook one morning while cleaning the counter drawer, the one with soft, faded pages that told the story of the letter and everything that followed. At first, she didn't know who had written it. There was no name, just a calm, steady voice in the words that told of love found too late, of a letter delivered decades after it was written, and of the quiet strength of the woman who brought it home. As she read, she felt tears gather without warning. There was something so pure in those pages, something real, human, and timeless. It felt as though the story wasn't just about one woman or one letter. It was about everyone who had ever lost someone, everyone who had ever wished for one more chance to say what they never said. After finishing the notebook, she sat there for a long while, the bookstore silent except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. The thought crossed her mind, maybe this story isn't meant to stay hidden. The next day, she placed the notebook beside the framed letter on the counter. Beneath it, she added a small sign, the letter that changed everything. People began to notice. At first, they would just glance at it, but soon more and more visitors stopped to read the notebook's pages. Some stayed for hours, others left quietly, their eyes glistening. The young owner began to see the same pattern that had once started years ago. People leaving letters, messages, poems, and sometimes even photographs in the small wooden box near the counter. She kept them all, carefully placing each one inside a small cabinet behind her desk. One afternoon, an elderly couple entered the shop. The man walked slowly, leaning on his cane, while the woman held his hand tightly as if afraid to let go. They browsed the shelves, smiling now and then, until the woman stopped near the framed letter. She stood there for a long time, her eyes glimmering. After a moment, she turned to the owner and asked softly, "Is it true? Did someone really find this letter in a book?" "Yes," the owner said gently. "It was found many years ago. The story is written in that notebook beside it." The woman nodded and smiled faintly. "It reminds me of something that happened in my family," she whispered. "My father once wrote a letter to my mother during the war. It never reached her. She found it almost 50 years later when we moved houses. She cried like she was 20 again." The young owner felt her chest tighten with emotion. "Some words wait," she said quietly. "Sometimes longer than we expect." The older woman smiled. "Yes, but they always find a way." They bought a small book before leaving, and as they walked out, the man turned back, looked around the cozy shop and said, "Places like this keep the world gentle." That evening, after closing, the owner sat by the counter reading through some of the letters left in the box. Most were anonymous. Some were addressed to lost parents, some to friends, some to people who had never known how deeply they were loved. She read one that simply said, "Dear future me, please remember that even when life feels quiet, someone out there is thinking of you with kindness." She folded the letter back gently, her eyes wet. She had never met the original owner of the bookstore, yet she felt connected to her in a way that words couldn't explain, as if she were carrying on something much bigger than herself. That winter, the town's local newspaper reached out to her. They had heard whispers about the letter bookstore and wanted to write about it again, to see what had become of the place all these years later. When the journalist visited, the young owner shared the notebook, the framed letter, and the story as she had come to understand it. She spoke of how one act of kindness had created ripples through generations, turning a simple bookstore into a haven of love and remembrance. The article was published with the headline, "Where Words Find Home, the bookstore that keeps love alive." Soon, people from faraway towns began to visit. Some came just to see the place. Others came to leave their own unsent letters. The wooden box overflowed with them, words of regret, gratitude, forgiveness, and hope. One morning, while organizing the letters, the young owner noticed a small envelope she hadn't seen before. It was yellowed and fragile, with handwriting that looked old-fashioned. Across the front it said only, "For the one who believes in stories." Curious, she opened it carefully. Inside was a short note written in faded ink. "Thank you for keeping this place alive." It was never just about one letter. It was about what happens when someone decides to care. When you care, you become part of the story, too. There was no signature, but as she read those words, she felt a strange warmth pass through her, as if someone had whispered them softly beside her. She looked around the shop, at the books, the letters, the framed note on the wall, and smiled. Maybe some stories really do live forever. Maybe love, once written, never disappears. As spring returned, the bookstore looked more beautiful than ever. The light poured through the windows, warming the pages of the books and the hearts of everyone who entered. One quiet afternoon, the young owner stood by the window, looking out at the world beyond the glass. She saw a little girl walking with her mother, holding a small notebook in her hands. The girl stopped, pressed her nose against the window, and smiled at the shelves full of books. The owner opened the door and said, "Would you like to come in?" The girl nodded shyly. Inside, she looked around in wonder. Her eyes landed on the framed letter near the counter. "Who wrote that?" she asked curiously. The owner smiled. "Someone who loved someone very much," she said. The girl looked at it for a while, then whispered, "It's pretty." The woman nodded. "It is." The girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Can I leave my letter here too?" Her mother smiled, a little surprised. "You brought one?" The girl nodded and pulled out a small piece of paper from her pocket. She placed it gently into the wooden box, her tiny hands careful and sure. When they left, the owner peeked at the letter. In simple, uneven handwriting, it said, "Dear Grandpa, I miss you. I hope you're happy where you are. I love you forever." She pressed the paper gently to her chest and whispered, "He heard you." That evening, as the sun set and the bookstore filled with the golden glow of dusk, she sat near the counter and closed her eyes. The air felt warm, peaceful, full of quiet voices, laughter, and love that had crossed time and space to meet here. And though she never knew what came after each letter, she had learned one thing for certain. Once words are written with love, they never truly disappear. They travel through hearts, through years, through strangers who become part of their journey. The bookstore would go on. New stories would arrive. New hands would hold the same books. New hearts would find the same peace. And somewhere beyond the reach of time, the woman who once found that first letter would be smiling, proud, content, and at peace, knowing her small act of kindness had changed countless lives. Because in the end, that's what stories do. They keep love alive.